Okay, so I am starting on for me, it's page 175 in the paper version. For you guys on the reading calendar, this is in between last Friday's section, which is We Fought a Lot, and Monday's section, yesterday's section. So it's in between those two sections, and I should be able to finish up all the way through the end of Monday's homework during this class period. Like I said, all of the YouTube videos, the Glass Castle YouTube videos, they're up on my YouTube channel, which I can drop into the chat once this is done. The winter came hard that year. Just after Thanksgiving, the first big snow started with fat, wet flakes the size of butterflies. They floated down lazily, but were followed by smaller, drier flakes that kept coming for days. At first, I loved winter in Welch. The blanket of snow hid the soot, and it made the entire town seem clean and cozy. Our house looked almost like all the others along Little Hobart Street. It was so cold that the youngest, most fragile branches snapped in the frigid air, and very quickly I started feeling it. I still only had my thin wool coat with the buttons missing. I felt almost as cold in the house. While we had the coal stove, we had no coal. There were 42 coal retailers listed in the Welch phone book. A ton of coal, which would last most of winter, cost about $50, including delivery, or even as low as $30 for the lowest grade stuff. Mom said she was sorry, but there was no room in our budget for coal. We'd have to devise other ways to stay warm. Pieces of coal were always falling off trucks when they made their deliveries, and Brian suggested that he and I get a bucket and collect some. We were walking along Little Hobart Street, picking up pieces of coal when our neighbors, the Noes, drove by in their station wagon. The No girls, Karen and Carol, were sitting in the backward-facing jump seat looking out the rear window. "We're working on our rock collection," I shouted. The pieces we found were so small that after an hour we'd only filled half the bucket. We needed at least a bucket to keep a fire going for one evening, so while we made occasional coal collecting expeditions, we mostly used wood. We couldn't afford wood any more than we could afford coal, and Dad wasn't around to chop and split any, which meant it was up to us kids to gather dead branches and logs from the forest. Finding good, dry wood was a challenge. We trekked along the mountainside looking for pieces that weren't waterlogged or rotten, shaking the snow off branches. But we went through the wood awfully quickly. And while coal fire burns hot, a wood fire doesn't throw off much heat. We all huddled around the pot-bellied stove, wrapped in blankets, holding out our hands toward the weak, smoky heat. Mom said we should be thankful because we had it better than pioneers who didn't have modern conveniences like window glass or cast iron stoves. One day we got a roaring fire going, but even as we could still see our own breath, there was ice on both sides of the windows. Brian and I decided we needed to make the fire even bigger and went out to collect more wood. On the way back, Brian stopped and looked at our house. "There's no snow on our roof," he said. He was right. It had completely melted. "Every other house has snow on its roof," he said. He was right about that too. "This house doesn't have a lick of insulation," Brian told Mom when he got back inside. "All the heat's going through the roof." "We may not have insulation," Mom said, as we gathered around the stove, "but we have each other." It got so cold in the house that the icicles hung from the kitchen ceiling. The water in the sink turned into a solid block of ice, and the dirty dishes were stuck there as if they'd been cemented in place. Even the pan of water that we kept in the living room to wash up in usually had a layer of ice on it. We walked around the house wearing our coats and wrapped in blankets. We wore our coats to bed, too. There was no stove in the bedroom, and no matter how many blankets I piled on top of myself, I still felt cold. I lay awake at night rubbing my feet with my hands, trying to warm them. We fought over who got to sleep with the dogs. Tinkle, the Jack Russell Terrier, and Pippin, a curly-haired mutt who had wandered down through the woods one day because they kept us warm. They usually ended up in a heap with Mom because she had a bigger body and they were cold too. Brian had bought us an iguana at G.C. Murphy, the Five and Dime on McDowell Street, because it reminded him of the desert. He named the lizard Iggy and slept with it against his chest to keep it warm. But it froze to death one night. We had to leave the faucet under the house dripping or the water would freeze in the pipe. When it got really cold, the water froze anyway, and we'd wake up to find a big icicle hanging from the faucet. We tried to thaw the pipe by running a burning piece of wood along it, but it would be frozen so solid that there was nothing we could do but wait for the next warm spell. When the pipe froze like that, we got our water by melting snow or icicles in the tin pan on the pot-bellied stove. A couple of times, when there wasn't enough snow on the ground, Mom sent me next door to borrow a pail of water from Mr. Freeman, a retired miner who lived in the house with his grown son and daughter, Peanut and Prissy. He never turned me down outright, but he would look at me for a minute in silence, then shake his head and disappear into the house. When he passed out the bucket, he would give me another disgusted head shake, even after I assured him that he could have as much water from us as he wanted come spring. I hate winter, I told Mom. All seasons have something to offer, she said. Cold weather is good for you, kills the germs. That seemed to be true, because none of us kids ever got sick. But even if I'd woken up one morning with a raging fever, I never would have admitted it to Mom. Being sick might have meant staying at home in our freezing house, instead of spending the day in a toasty classroom. Another good thing about the cold weather was that it kept odors to a minimum. By New Year's, we had washed our clothes only once since that first November snowfall. In the summer, Mom had bought a wringer washer machine like the one we'd had in Phoenix, and we kept it in the kitchen. When we had electricity, we washed clothes and hung them out on the front porch to dry. Even when the weather was warm, they'd have to stay out there for days because it's always so damp in the hollow on the north side of the mountain. But then it got cold, and the one time we did our laundry, it froze on the porch. We brought the clothes inside. The socks had hardened into the shape of question marks, and the pants were so stiff you could lean them against the wall. And we banged them against the stove, trying to soften them up. At least we don't need to buy starch, Lori said. Even with the cold, by January, we were all so rank that Mom decided it was time to splurge. We would go to a laundromat. We loaded our dirty clothes into pillowcases and lugged them down the hill and up Stewart Street. Mom put the loaded bag on her head the way women in Africa do and tried to get us to do the same. She said it was better for our posture and easier on our spines, but there was no way we kids were going to be caught dead walking through Welch with laundry bags on our heads. We followed Mom with our bags over our shoulders, rolling our eyes when we passed people to show we agreed with them. The lady with a bag on her head looked pretty peculiar. The laundromat, with its windows completely steamed up, was as warm and damp as a Turkish bath. Mom let us put the coins in the washers, and then we climbed up and sat on them. The heat from the rumbling machines warmed our behinds and spread up through our bodies. When the wash was done, we heaved the armfuls of wet clothes into the dryer and watched them tumbling around as if they were some fun carnival ride. Once the cycle was over, we pulled out the scorching hot clothes and buried our faces in them. We spread them on the tables and folded them carefully, lining up the sleeves of our shirts and the seams of the pants and balling up the paired up socks. We never folded our clothes at home, but that laundromat was so warm and cozy, we were looking for any excuse to extend our stay. A warm spell in January seemed like good news, but then the snow started melting and the wood and the forest became totally soaked. We couldn't get a fire to do anything but smutter and smoke. If the wood was wet, we doused it with kerosene that we used in the lamps. Dad was disdainful of a fire starter like kerosene. No true frontiersman would ever stoop to use it. It wasn't cheap, and since it didn't burn hot, it took a lot to make the wood catch fire. And also, it was dangerous. Dad said that if you got sloppy with kerosene, it could explode. But still, if the wood was wet and it didn't want to catch, and we were all freezing, we would pour a little kerosene on it. One day, Brian and I climbed the hillside to try to find some dry wood, while Lori stayed in the house stoking the fire. As Brian and I were shaking the snow off some promising branches, we heard a loud boom from the house. I turned and saw flames leap up inside the windows. We dropped our wood and ran back down the hill. Lori was lurching around the living room, her eyebrows and bangs all singed off, and the smell of burned hair in the air. She had used kerosene to try to get the fire going better, and it had exploded just like Dad had said it would. Nothing in the house except Lori's hair had caught on fire, but the explosion had blown back her coat and skirt, and the flames had scorched her thighs. Brian went out and got some snow, and we packed it on Lori's legs, which were dark pink. The next day she had blisters the length of her thighs. Just remember, Mom said after examining the blisters, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. If that was true, I'd be Hercules by now, Lori said. Days later, when the blisters burst, the clear liquid inside ran down her feet. For weeks, the front of her legs were open sores, so sensitive that she had trouble sleeping under the blankets. But by then, the temperature had fallen again, and if she kicked off the blankets, she froze. One day that winter, I went to a classmate's house to work on a school project. Carrie Mae Blankenship's father was an administrator at the McDowell County Hospital, and her family lived in a solid brick house on McDowell Street. The living room was decorated in shades of orange and brown, and the plaid pattern of the curtains matched the couch upholstery. On the wall was a framed photo of Carrie Mae's older sister in her high school graduation gown. It was lit with its own tiny lamp, just like in a museum. There was also a small plastic box on the wall near the living room door. A row of tiny numbers ran along the top under a lever. Carrie Mae's father saw me studying the box while she was out of the room. "It's a thermostat," he told me. "You move the lever to make the house warmer or cooler." I thought he was pulling my leg, but he moved the lever, and I heard a muffled roar kick on in the basement. "That's the furnace," he said. He led me over to a vent on the floor and had me hold my hand above it and feel the warm air wafting upward. I didn't want to say anything to show how impressed I was, but for many nights afterwards, I dreamed that we had a thermostat at 93 Little Hobart Street. I dreamed that all we had to do was fill our house was that warm, clean furnace. What furnace heat was to move a lever. Okay, so now this section is Tuesday's reading, where it starts with Irma died. For me, it's page 180, and on your reading calendar, hang on. So for you guys, this would be page 103. Irma died during the last hard snowfall at the end of our second winter in Welch. Dad said her liver simply gave out. Mom took the position that Irma drank herself to death. It was a suicide every bit as much as if she had stuck her own head in the oven, Mom said, only slower. Whatever the cause, Irma had made a detailed preparation in the occasion of her death. For years, she had read the Welch Daily News only for the obituaries and black-bordered memorial notices, clipping and saving her favorites. They provided inspiration for her own death announcement, which she had worked and reworked. She had also written pages of instructions on how she wanted her funeral conducted. She had picked out the hymns and the prayers, chosen her favorite funeral home, ordered a lavender lace nightgown from JCPenney that she wanted to be buried in, and selected a two-toned lavender casket with shiny chrome handles from the mortician's catalog. Irma's death brought out Mom's pious side. While we were waiting for the preacher, she took out her rosary and prayed for Irma's soul, which she feared was in jeopardy since, as she saw it, Irma had committed suicide. She also tried to make us kiss Irma's corpse. We flat out refused. But Mom went up in front of the mourners, genuflected with a grand sweep, and then kissed Irma's cheek so vigorously that you could hear the puckering sound through the chapel. I was sitting next to Dad. It was the first time in my life I'd ever seen him wearing a necktie, which he always called a noose. His face was tight and closed, but I could tell he was distraught. More distraught than I'd ever seen him, which surprised me because Irma had seemed to have some sort of an evil hold over Dad, and I thought he'd be relieved to be free of it. As we walked home, Mom asked us kids if we had anything nice to say about Irma now that she had passed. We took a couple of steps in silence, and then Lori said, "Ding dong, the witch is dead." Brian and I started snickering. Dad wheeled around and gave Lori a cold, angry look that I thought he might wallop her. "She was my mother, for God's sake," he said. He glared at us. "You kids. You make me ashamed. Do you hear me? Ashamed." He turned down the street to Junior's bar. We all watched him go. "You're ashamed of us?" Lori called after him. Dad just kept walking. 4 days later, when Dad still hadn't come home, Mom sent me to go find him. "Why do I always have to go find Dad?" I asked. "Because he likes you best," she said, "and he'll come home if you tell him to." The first step in tracking down Dad was going next door to the Freemans, who let us use their phone if we paid a dime, and calling Grandpa to ask if Dad was there. Grandpa said he had no idea where Dad was. "When are y'all going to get your own telephone?" Mr. Freeman asked after I hung up. Mom disapproves of telephones, I said, as I placed the dime on his coffee table. She thinks they're an impersonal means of communication. My first stop, as always, was Junior's. It was the fanciest bar in Welch, with a picture window, a grill that served hamburgers and french fries, and a pinball machine. Hey, one of the regulars called out when I walked in. It's Rex's little girl. How you doing, sweetheart? I'm fine, thank you. Is my dad here? Rex? He turned to the man next to him. Where's that old polecat, Rex? I seen him this morning at the Howdy House. Honey, you look like you could use a rest, the bartender said. Sit down and have a Coca-Cola on the house. No, thank you. I've got kites to fly and fresh fish to fry. I went to the Howdy House, which was a notch below Junior's. It was smaller and darker, and the only food it served was pickled eggs. The bartender told me Dad had gone to the pub, which was a notch below the Howdy House, almost pitch black, with sticky bar top and no food at all. And there he was, in the midst of a few other regulars, telling the Air Force stories. When Dad saw me, he stopped talking and looked at me the way he did every time I had to track him down in a bar. And it was always an awkward moment for both of us. I didn't want to be fetching him any more than he wanted his ragamuffin daughter summoning him home like a wayward schoolboy. He looked at me in this cold, strange way for just a moment, and then broke into a hearty grin. Hey, mountain goat, he shouted. The hell are you doing in this dive? Mom says you have to come home, I said. She does she? He ordered a Coca-Cola for me and another shot of whiskey for himself. I kept telling Dad it was time to go, but he kept putting me off and ordering more shots, as if he had to gulp a whole bunch of them down before he could face home. He staggered off to the bathroom, came back, ordered one for the road, slammed the shot glass down on the bar, and walked to the door. He lost his footing trying to open it and sprawled on the floor. I tried to help him up, but he kept falling over. Honey, you ain't getting him nowhere like that, a man behind me said. Here, let me give you a lift home. I'd appreciate that, sir, I said, if it's not out of your way. Some of the other regulars helped the man and me load Dad into the bay of the man's pickup truck. We propped Dad up against the tool chest. It was late afternoon in the early spring, and the light was beginning to fade, and people on McDowell Street were locking up their shops and heading home. Dad started singing one of his favorite songs. Swing low, sweet chariot, comin' for to carry me home. Dad had a fine baritone with strength and timbre and range, and despite being tanked, he sang the hymn like the roof raiser it is. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Comin' for to carry me home. A band of angels comin' after me, comin' for to carry me home. I climbed in next to the driver, and on the way home, with Dad still singing away in the back, extending the word low, so low that he sounded like a mooing cow, the man asked me about school. And I told him I was studying hard because I wanted to become either a veterinarian or a geologist specializing in the Miocene period, when the mountains out west were formed. I was telling him how geodes were created from the bubbles of lava when he interrupted me. For the daughter of the town drunk, you sure got big plans, he said. Stop the truck, I said. We can make it on our own from here. Oh, no, I didn't mean anything by that. And you know you ain't getting him home on your own. Still, he stopped. I opened the pickup's tailgate and I tried to drag Dad out, but the man was right, I couldn't do it. So I climbed back in next to the driver, folded my arms across my chest and stared straight ahead. When we reached 93 Little Hobart Street, he helped me pull Dad out. I know you took offense at what I said, the man said. The thing is, I meant it as a compliment. Maybe I should have thanked him, but I just waited till he drove off, and then I called Brian to help me get Dad up the hill and into the house. All right, so I'm going to stop reading there. I will keep this window open. So if you guys have any questions while you're working on your papers, or you're working on either reading Glass Castle or on your choice board, you're more than welcome to ask me in the chat. But I'm going to turn off my microphone and camera, and I will answer any questions in the chat for y'all.
Miss Kohanna. Actually, you can type it in the chat. Ask her.